Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Jacques. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and also slightly nervous to be presenting work on behalf of NCRP. I'm the only non-US person on the committee, so obviously you can understand my position. I'm going to talk about a new report that will come out shortly on decision-making for late-phase recovery from nuclear and radiological incidents. And in the US, up until recently, most of the effort has been put into triaging the sort of early and intermediate phases of emergencies, and very little has been done on the more complex situation to do with late phase recovery. And as everybody knows from Fukushima and Chernobyl, then there is very much wide area contamination, which has led to very, very long-term recovery issues. So in 2008, the Department of Homeland Security issued some protective action guides for RDDs and INDs. And this dealt mainly with the emergency, early, intermediate and late phases of response. And there were actual numerical values given for those guides. But in terms of late phase, then the recommendation was for optimization. So there was no cleanup values advised at that time. And clearly, although optimization was mentioned, there wasn't any great detail associated with how to go about it. So the DHS in 2010 commissioned NCRP to assemble a committee to try and flesh out the processes and procedures involved in optimization for late phase recovery. And the scope originally of the NCRP work was to focus on RDDs and INDs. But as the work progressed through the committee, it was decided to expand the scope to all types of incidents, as it seemed an opportunity missed not to do so. So this is a picture of the committee. There's 16 members, a quite wide range of experience and backgrounds, and also drawn from sort of government departments and agencies, universities, consultancies, and so on. And just to point out the chair of the committee, S.Y. Chen, there. So when the report finally comes out, it will be report number 175, and it's under final scientific editorial review at the moment. So we're expecting it late this year, early next year. And clearly, there has been a limited number of radiological incidents and accidents, and we've had to draw very much on those past incidents in helping us to inform what actually is involved in optimization in late phase recovery. So we've looked at the big events like Fukushima, Chernobyl, but also smaller events. We've looked at weapons testing, malicious events, and also military activities to try and inform us. The NCRP report 175 covers a wide range of areas and chapters, and today I'm just focusing on the optimization process for decision making. But for those that are interested in more general terms in late phase recovery, then there's some very good information on nuclear and radiological incidents leading to long-term contamination and recovery, both in terms of what the incidents might be and also what the conditions in the environment are that require recovery. There's also the background to the decision framework, all the things you might need to know in order to embark on late phase recovery. There's a lot of information on long-term monitoring. There's some very, very good recommendations for future, for the US to take on board, and very informative appendices on past events, on managing radioactive waste, decontamination technologies, economic analyses in terms of trying to select options, risk communication, and also some practical aspects of optimization that have come out from Fukushima. So where does late phase recovery begin? Everyone has their own ideas, everyone has their own figures and diagrams to try and divide accidents into different phases, and it's quite artificial, but you do need something. So clearly there's a preparedness stage, there's a short term, intermediate term and long term. And from this picture, yes, you would be planning ongoing for late phase recovery, but really it has its roots in the short term. By some of the decisions that are made, you have to think in the short term about what the implications are for late phase recovery. And this continues through maybe some of the clean-up actions that you do originally into the long term, which is the legacy. What do you do with the waste from the clean-up that you've done perhaps in the short and intermediate phase? So that gives you an idea of the timescales that we've been working on, all of them really, but looking more at the long term. And something that's very important and has come more important in recent years is this idea of resilience. And what this graph shows is that if you do nothing and you just have, I can't actually read what it says here, but if you don't do anything towards resilience before an incident happens, then you might actually expect something business as usual community, that's it. And it takes quite a long time to get back to a normal. And in fact, you may never get back to what your original normal was. And without resources, etc., it could be way below what you had before in terms of community function, etc. If you do a lot of preparation in advance of an incident, then you are much better prepared. You're likely to be more resilient. You're likely to be able to respond much better and recover much better. And in fact, a resilient community responds and recovers more quickly, and also it can actually have a sort of better normality than it had before. And this all depends on amounts of resources put into building infrastructure, communication, education, involving the community. But resilience is very, very important to recovery. So NCRP didn't start with a blank sheet of paper. There was the ICRP publication in 2009, publication 111, and also the National Disaster Recovery Framework in the US in 2011, which wasn't nuclear specific, but clearly the ICRP document was. So NCRP had a lot of good material to work on. In the ICRP document, it talks about late phase recovery issues, the principles of protection, the justification, optimization. It recognises that late phase recovery is an existing exposure situation, and the idea there is establishing reference levels of residual dose, which has already been mentioned this morning, in the range 1 to 20 millisieverts, with a typical value, a long-term goal of 1, with ALARA considerations. So NCRP took this on board, and it concurs with ICRP that the radiological protection in the late phase is not only a matter of radiological protection. There are so many other issues at stake, and it involves rebuilding the whole community, the infrastructure, public services, business and employment, remediation of the contamination. And here the considerations again isn't just, is the radiation going to cause cancer, but much wider public health and welfare issues, the socioeconomics, not least to mention the waste generation and the environmental impact that may cause. And again, we've already heard this morning the very important issue of communication. So what NCRP has done, this is just one figure for an enormous report, is to try and recognise how complicated optimisation process for decision making is. It's tried to divide it into a series of steps where stakeholders will be involved at each step. And the point here is, it's not, you just don't go round the circle once. You actually may have to go round it several times, many times, and maybe at different levels within the country, within the area affected. So what I'm going to do now is just briefly go through the different steps. Now, step 1 is defining the situation, which seems pretty obvious. And you're not coming into it from the emergency phase. You already have quite a lot of information about the contamination, where it is, what it is, which radionuclides are involved. You will have probably located the hot spots. You will have got external dose rate, ground deposition, surface contamination. You will know a lot about the activity concentrations in food, water, consumer products. You will have done a lot of measurements in the environment, in people's houses, in towns, cities, kids' playgrounds, etc. You will know about the land use, essential services that may have been affected, and where people are living and their habits and how many people are affected. So that's quite an obvious step one. Oops. Step two is assessing the impact. And here, it's not just the radiological impact, or clearly for this audience, it is very, very important. So yes, the use of environmental monitoring data and assessment models to assess what the doses are to the representative people, and then to identify what the most important pathways of exposure are and the timeline. This can be very complicated. There are multiple radionuclides, multiple pathways, etc. So it's very important, if you're going to spend resources, to know where best that you can intervene to reduce the dose. It's not about activity concentrations as such in the environment. It's about where people are getting their doses from. And then we also have to take on board the non-radiological impacts, psychological, health and welfare, and ecological. Having done that, then it's very important to identify what the goals and options are for late phase recovery. They may be based on radiological criteria, and I'm sure they will be to a certain extent, and this is where perhaps the reference levels of dose to constrain optimization will be important. But also, in order to get the community back to normal, and ultimately that's what the overall goal of recovery is, then clearly there must be some economic and business targets. And possibly where there is very little opportunity for waste disposal, then minimizing waste generation may be a very valid goal to have. In terms of options, this is something that we've heard this morning. There are many, many options, and that's very reassuring. There were many options described in great detail following the Chernobyl accident, and now much more work has been done post-Fukushima. So we're in a really good shape, I think, in terms of what options we may be able to use, whether it's controlling access, modifying people's behaviour, intervening in inhabited areas, food production systems, drinking water, and also the very, very important self-help actions that people have been undertaking. And depending on what goals you have, it will influence what options you will select. If you want to minimize waste generation, you won't necessarily go for something that's very effective if it's going to generate a lot of waste. You may wish to go for less effective options that don't generate waste. So the two things are very linked, options and goals. Just a little bit here on the radiological goals. Then, because it's an optimization process, the Department of Homeland Security has said there's no preset cleanup criteria. In fact, the criteria for wide area contamination are going to be different from those used in conventional cleanup in the US. And because there's multiple land use scenarios, pathways, and radionuclides, it's very complicated. So it's important to understand the pathways of exposure. And as I said before, the focus should be on doses, not activity concentrations in various media. And when we're looking at applying reference levels as a sort of guide to constrain optimization, then it's important to do this in collaboration with the stakeholders by going for a very restrictive target immediately, like 1 millisievert per year. You can see from this slide, then it can actually generate huge amounts of waste. Well, you can't see it from this slide, but the amount of area affected is large. And of course, the more stringent your cleanup criteria, the larger areas that will be affected, and ultimately potentially the large amount of waste you generate. So that has to be discussed with stakeholders, knowing the full implications of selecting a cleanup criteria of 1 straight away. Having looked at your goals and options, you need to evaluate them. There's many criteria with which you can use to evaluate options, and there's a list given on this slide. There are compendia of information on all the management options, and here I can refer to the UK Recovery Handbook for Radiation Incidents, also the European handbooks. There are very, very good data sheets set up in such a way that you can immediately assess these type of criteria. And there's also various techniques that can be used in order to try and evaluate them. But I think having stakeholders involved in the evaluation process is key, whether you're using cost-benefit analysis, multi-attribute, other economic models, or you're just sitting down discussing the options. It's very important to involve the people. This slide just quickly shows that if you've got very wide area contamination, then some of the options that you might choose on a small scale, which can be quite expensive, probably aren't able to be applied on a very large scale, whereas things like natural attenuation, which, you know, we were talking about cesium-134, it will decay away. So in some circumstances, it may be possible just to have some very non-invasive techniques that are cheap. Waste disposal is a key issue. In the US at the moment, then the existing waste classification system is too rigid. It's based on the origin of the waste rather than on the risk posed by it. So if there was an incident involving wide area contamination, there would be serious waste disposal issues in the US. So what Fukushima has informed us is that there needs to be to design and implement a robust waste disposal plan using existing infrastructure if possible, and bearing in mind where sites would be for temporary storage and treatment, and making the waste accessible for packaging and transport and onward movement. And the picture there is just of a temporary waste disposal site after cleanup of, I think, one of the children's museums in Fukushima, and a remote car park was used for that. Moving on to step 5, the decision-making process. With wide area contamination, it's probably quite unlikely that situation will return to normal, or certainly it won't return to normal in any time soon. And it's very, very important to engage the community in the process of trade-offs, consensus building, what people really want. And it's important to involve the local people because they have the local knowledge, and also all the cultural aspects need to be taken into account. It may be that there's changes required to regulatory infrastructure, particularly perhaps when we consider waste disposal and so on. And it is complex, it's multifaceted, it isn't easy. It's got to be graded, proportionate to the situation, and bearing in mind that dose isn't the only factor. And in fact, if it is considered as the only factor, then it will lead to other problems later on. So above all, there has to be transparency in whatever is decided on. When it comes to implementation, the transparency continues throughout the whole implementation process, looking at whether goals are being reached, targets and so on, the rationale for why people are doing what they're doing, and also whether the success criteria are being met. And if they're not, being upfront to say why they're not being met. Pilot studies are very important, as we've heard from Fukushima, just to test things out before we use them on a wide scale. And again, people will be interested to know that this is going on. And also to appreciate that the background levels are not likely to be achieved following cleanup. And that could be due to all sorts of reasons, just for the fact that the land around hasn't been cleaned, or the trees, etc. So it's very unlikely to get back to background levels, and it's important to be transparent about that. The final step is obviously to monitor and evaluate the situation, monitor everything to do with health, the environment, and then to see whether your success criteria have been met. If they haven't, well then you go round the loop again, and so on until you reach what you think is the end point, and this has to be agreed with the community and the stakeholders. I don't really need to say too much about stakeholders. There's some very, very good work already published in the literature, starting with the IRPA 2009 guidelines, and then FEMA have also written a publication about whole community approach, and here they discuss the roles and responsibilities of different stakeholders. And also, one could have a whole workshop on risk communication. So this is really just a placeholder to say it's absolutely key. If we want to avoid stigma in the long term, there has to be prompt delivery of relevant and accurate information, transparency at all times, and whether that's good or bad, whether mistakes have been made, it's important to own up to them. Consistency, clarity, completeness on the use and meaning of radiation measurements, and all the jargon that we use has to be much clearer. Also, relevant risk comparators would be useful. how to reduce or avoid exposures, let people know how they can help themselves. So anticipation of what might happen, preparation for it if it does, and then to actually practice it in exercises and so on. There are a few challenges that have to be overcome, certainly in the US, to this idea of optimization. On the left-hand side is a sort of a snippet from a news review, which basically talks about relaxation of standards. And I would say that addressing wide area remediation is a departure from the conventional cleanup approach used in the US, and therefore there could be considerable opposition in this new approach if it isn't communicated properly. And this slide just compares the two. So in conventional cleanup for some of the contaminated sites in the US, then there's controlled access, radiological risk is the main focus. There's very much precautionary decision making. The cleanup goals are close to background, and there is an expectation by everybody that the incident conditions will return, pre-incident conditions will be returned. For wide area contamination, then what we have is unrestricted access. We use non-radiological risks as well as radiological risks. There has to be practical decision making. The iterative cleanup process has no preset goals. There has to be an acceptance of a new normality. And these are going to be quite difficult things to get over, I think, when the report is finally published. There will have to be some very good communication surrounding this. So coming towards the conclusions then, there have been, I think, 8 recommendations given in the report. This is just trying to enhance the current planning for late phase recovery in the US. So there needs to be a development of a national strategy promoting community resilience. Late phase recovery needs to be integrated into planning and ensure it's exercised. And to date, we had one very big exercise, Liberty RADX, in 2010, which was very, very useful and did inform the requirements of late phase recovery. But this needs to be done again at some point, even if it's desktop-based. To embrace the optimization paradigm for managing non-conventional wide area contamination, which currently isn't the case. Ensure that stakeholder engagement and empowerment underpins the optimization process. Develop a communication plan as an integral part of the preparedness strategy. Develop adaptive and responsive policies, including those for waste management. Conduct some research and development to specifically address the impact of wide area contamination. It's no good having lots of options that only work on a small scale. There needs to be more what will work on a larger scale, and to a certain extent we can learn from Japan. Establish a mechanism to integrate the lessons learned from past incidents. So in conclusion, we've found that the ICRP publication 111 underpins the new NCRP 175 report. But the new report by NCRP further develops the ideas and concepts, and it provides details on how to implement optimization through an iterative 7-step process. However, it's not all good news at the moment. There will be a challenge in the United States to gain acceptance from a departure from the conventional cleanup approach for wide area from the conventional cleanup approach in favor of wide area contamination that's based on an optimization process. Thank you for your attention.